It was one of those Oxford evenings that arrive not with the dignity of twilight, but with the slight embarrassment of drizzle, the kind of light that makes even the new buildings seem apologetic for being made of glass. I had opened the window to let in what passed for fresh air in Jericho, though what drifted in was mostly the faint musk of wet cobblestone and the echo of a distant choir. From somewhere east of St. Simeon's, I thought about the rehearsal of Vespers. Those boys' voices, so pure they made one's conscience sound coarse by comparison. I was pouring the second half of a Glenfiddich when the sound wavered. A single note faltered not disastrously, merely enough to betray human presence behind divine aspiration. That imperfection interested me. I have never trusted perfection. It's usually forged by deceit or denial. The next morning's Oxford Mail contained a short column, as they so often do when death visits decently. Verger collapses before Vespers at St. Simeon's College. Cause believed to be natural. I read it twice, not for the information, but for the rhythm. Before Vespers. The words had that faint scent of uncertainty, as though the reporter had been told exactly when not to ask further questions. Later that day, I found myself walking toward St. Simeon's, though I had no case there. The drizzle had hardened into a fine mist that polished the college gates to a sullen gleam. The porter, an amiable man named Rouse, who smelled faintly of brass polish and resignation, informed me that the deceased had been one Arthur Kellen, verger of 22 years, reliable to a fault, beloved by the choir. He said it as one might describe a dependable clock that had stopped unexpectedly. Inside, the quadrangle exhaled its usual quiet grandeur. A pair of undergraduates hurried past, their conversation brisk, self-satisfied, and fleeting as a sparrow's flight. I envied them in the way one sometimes envies strangers for not being oneself. The chapel door stood ajar, and from within came the dry rustle of hymn books being gathered. The smell of wax polish and damp cassocks recalled a time when faith was still a language one could half understand. Dr. Felix Morland was there, his pale face illuminated by the filtered light through the stained glass. He was a historian of ecclesiastical music, or so the plaque outside his rooms had once announced. We had met years ago over a public lecture on birds' masses. I remembered him as precise to the point of cruelty, a man who corrected your Latin pronunciation and then offered you sherry as an apology. He told me he had been in his rooms at the time of the collapse, correcting essays on Palestrina. His tone suggested that Kellen's death was an unfortunate interruption in a day of otherwise valuable scholarship. There was, I thought, something brittle in the way he adjusted his spectacles whenever the name Arthur was mentioned. On the vestry shelf, unnoticed by the others, stood a whisky, tumbler its surface etched with a ring of drying amber. I doubted it belonged to Kellen. He was known for temperance bordering on sanctity, yet the glass remained there, half accusatory, half forgotten, as though someone had needed courage in liquid form before prayer. I lingered near the lectern, pretending to admire the brasswork. A hymnal lay open to lead, kindly light. The corners of its pages curled slightly, damp from the night air. My fingers traced the pencil mark beside a verse. I do not ask to see the distant scene, one step enough for me. That small plea for partial understanding resonated. Perhaps Kellen had marked it himself, or perhaps someone else wanted to make it seem so. Outside, the bell tower loomed against the gathering dusk, the ropes swaying idly like an undecided conscience. Rouse mentioned that the choir had been due to rehearse again that evening, but the master had cancelled it out of respect. The words sounded tidy, rehearsed, as if respect were merely another term for concealment. As I left, a flock of pigeons startled from the eaves, scattering like unspoken thoughts. I glanced back once more at the chapel window, where the reflection of a man, perhaps Morland, lingered too long in the glass before withdrawing behind the curtain. That night, in my flat, I poured another measure and filled in a half-completed crossword from the mail. The clue read, "Spirit before prayer, 6." I wrote the answer automatically. Whisky then paused. Something about it felt almost theological. I stared at the word until the letters lost meaning and became sound, like the bells of St. Simeon's fading across the rain-slicked city, calling the faithful to Vespers and the faithless, perhaps, to memory. I returned to St. Simeon's the following morning, though I could not have said why. Habit, perhaps, or that faint unease one feels when something refuses to align with its own explanation. The air was sharp, the kind of early light that bleaches the sandstone into pallor. A milk float rattled along the high. A porter's broom whispered across the flagstones. Oxford performed its little liturgy of cleanliness before the tourists arrived. Lewis met me outside the porter's lodge. He had that look of mild disapproval he reserves for mornings when I fail to offer a plan. The master, Dr. Fortescue, was expecting us. I remember the sound of our footsteps on the tiled corridor, a hollow ecclesiastical rhythm that made conversation feel like intrusion. Fortescue's study was as I imagined, heavy curtains, too much mahogany, the faint odor of sherry and moral authority. He spoke of the verger's reliability, his devotion, his simple life. I've found that phrase rarely describes simplicity. When I asked about the tumbler in the vestry, the master's voice stiffened. He had no idea how it got there. Kellen was a man of the cloth, not the cup. The deflection was too smooth. Afterwards, Lewis and I walked to the cloister. He said he couldn't see why a man's heart failing in church should interest us. I told him it wasn't the death that bothered me. It was the order of things in the sequence. The paper had said before, Vespers. But the choir, the porter, and the clock all disagreed about what before meant. Somewhere, 5 minutes had been borrowed or lost. We found Dr. Morland in the music room, conducting his own rehearsal of regret. He wore his fatigue like an academic gown. He greeted me without enthusiasm and offered a half apology for the disturbance the previous night. I asked if he had known Kellen well. He paused before replying, just long enough to betray the calculation behind sincerity. A good man, he said. Devout. Precise. Then he added, too quickly, that precision can become a vice in older men. On the piano lay an opening score of Bird's Miserere Me, Deus. A bookmark, a visiting card from a wine merchant in Jericho, protruded between the pages. It was a small, silly detail, but I noticed it because the merchant in question had closed his shop months ago. Morland, I suspected, was the sort of man who never bought his own whiskey, yet always knew where it was kept. Lewis spoke to the choir boys, and they said the rehearsal began late, not early. The porter's logbook, however, recorded that the vestry bell rang at 6:05, precisely the time Kellen was found. Someone, I thought, had wanted the evening to appear orderly, even when it was not. We stood by the chapel door as the rain began again, that gentle percussion Oxford uses to keep its secrets clean. Lewis mentioned the post-mortem heart failure. I said I believed it, but not the moment of it. The difference between before and during Vespers is hardly criminal, yet the human conscience can hinge on smaller things. A lie told to the clock is still a lie. Before leaving, I looked once more into the vestry. The tumbler had been removed, though a faint ring remained on the wood like a small private halo. Beside it, the hymnal still lay open at lead kindly light. The penciled line I'd seen yesterday, one step enough for me, had been rubbed out. Someone had tried to erase belief, or at least the evidence of it. As we crossed the quadrangle, the bell above us began its measured toll. I found myself counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, then silence. It should have struck 7. I looked up at the tower, its clock face dim beneath the drizzle. Perhaps a mechanical fault, Lewis suggested. Perhaps, but machines seldom err in such poetic ways. That evening, back in my flat, I reopened the crossword from the mail. The next clue read, "Sound before confession." 4. I wrote the answer without thinking, bell, and set my pen down. Somewhere in Oxford, one had rung too early, and I had begun to hear its echo. The morning bled slowly into the grey corridors of St. Simeon's, and I remember thinking how daylight in Oxford never quite conquers shadow. It merely negotiates with it. By then, the verger's death had already begun to fade into collegiate gossip, a tragic footnote, politely framed. Yet something in the stillness of that place suggested the story had not ended at the vestry door. Lewis and I began with the staff. The college seemed to produce them in the same mold. Cautious, courteous, and always on the verge of telling you something unimportant. Mrs. Calloway, the housekeeper, insisted Kellen had been a good man, quiet as dust, and then contradicted herself by adding that she often heard voices from the chapel after hours. She smiled when I asked if one of them was hers. There are people who find comfort in withholding the smallest truths. It gives them a sense of moral symmetry. Dr. Morland appeared later, pale as parchment, speaking in those clipped tones that make confession sound like grammar. He lamented the loss of a fine servant, and then drifted toward safer territory, the challenges of maintaining academic standards, the decline of Latin literacy, and the choir's uneven intonation. I let him talk. Sometimes people reveal more through the subjects they flee than the ones they pursue. I asked him, almost idly, whether Kellen had enemies. He hesitated, then smiled with one corner of his mouth, the kind of smile men use when they're thinking of something that once felt private. "Everyone admired Arthur," he said, though perhaps admiration is not always the same as affection. Later, I met Charlotte Dean in the music library. She was young, though Oxford youth often carries an air of ancient weariness. The light through the mullioned windows caught in her hair as she spoke of the choir, her voice low, perfectly pitched. She said Kellen had helped her with archival work, something about transcriptions for her fellowship proposal. She seemed determined to appear unflustered, which of course meant she was anything but. When she reached for a book, her sleeve brushed a sheet of manuscript paper, and I noticed a faint smudge of pencil where a line of notation had erased the mark of someone revising more than music. She asked whether I believed Kellen had truly died of natural causes. I told her belief had very little to do with my work, and less with my nature. For a moment, she looked as if she might say something else, and then the sound of footsteps in the corridor silenced her. When we stepped outside, the quadrangle had filled with students again, drifting like bright fish through the current of routine. Lewis remarked that the place reminded him of a well-tuned machine, polished, regular, and entirely indifferent to its own workings. I thought he was right. Death had disturbed nothing here. It had merely become another timetabled event. In Kellen's small quarters behind the chapel, we found a desk arranged with clerical neatness. I dislike searching the rooms of the dead. It feels indecently intimate, as though one were rifling through a person's conscience. On the desk lay a half-finished crossword torn from the Times. One clue was circled spirit before, prayer 6. I'd seen that before in my own copy, in the vestry's glass, in thought itself, but beside it now, in faint blue ink, was another annotation. Second verse led by example. That phrasing unsettled me. A private admonition or an echo of something heard in confession. I took the page and folded it into my coat. Lewis found nothing but church accounts and a letter from the diocesan office. I found the silence of the room harder to explain. When we left, I caught sight of Dr. Morland again across the courtyard, walking swiftly toward the cloisters with his collar up against the drizzle. He passed Charlotte without a word, though she turned slightly as if expecting one. At that moment, the non-exchange between them held a weight of unfinished history I could almost hear. Back in my flat, the crossword lay on the table beside an untouched glass. I stared at the clue until the words blurred. Spirit before prayer. There was an answer, of course, but I had begun to wonder whether the clue itself had been written for me. Oxford has a way of turning every question into something self-referential, and in that quiet, I began to suspect that the death at St. Simeon's had less to do with faith and more with the small hypocrisies that thrive beneath it. There are mornings when Oxford seems built not of stone, but of memory, soft, impressionable, always threatening to crumble if one looks too closely. That morning, the fog had rolled in low and thick, blurring the chapel spire into a hesitant gesture toward heaven. Lewis said it looked like the city was ashamed of itself. He wasn't wrong. We had returned to St. Simeon's to check the clock mechanism, though I think I already knew what we would find. The tower stairs were narrow and smelled of old brass and pigeon droppings. Each step creaked with that weary authority particular to places that have outlasted the faith they once served. The college handyman met us halfway up, apologizing for the inconvenience as though death itself were a maintenance issue. At the top, I examined the clock housing a beautiful piece of 19th century engineering, now half strangled by neglect. Lewis noted the rust. I noted the adjustment lever, recently moved. Someone had wound the time back. Only slightly, perhaps 6 minutes. A trivial lapse unless one cared deeply about the difference between before and during Vespers. Lewis squinted at the gears and asked who would bother meddling with such a thing. I told him only someone for whom the illusion of punctuality mattered more than truth. He looked at me the way he often does when he senses meaning without grasping it, a polite confusion I almost envied. Down in the quadrangle, the fog had begun to lift, revealing the neat symmetry of the lawns, the scholars crossing briskly toward lectures, the life of the college moving on as though time itself had agreed to keep the secret. We spoke again with Morland. He received us in his rooms where the air smelled faintly of polish and gilt. I noticed a half-empty decanter on the sideboard, the same brand I'd seen in the vestry glass. He claimed to drink rarely, though the claim had the hollow ring of practiced sincerity. When I mentioned the clock, he feigned ignorance, insisting that mechanical things bored him. I believed that, though not for the reason he thought. People who dislike machines often resent their reliability. He began lecturing us on the spiritual symbolism of choral music, how harmony was a moral state, and how dissonance reflected human weakness. I found myself staring at a small metronome on his desk, its pendulum still ticking, though no one had set it in motion. It reminded me of a relentless, unconsulted, unkind conscience. Later, I spoke briefly with one of the choir boys, a nervous lad with a voice too pure for this world. He told me the rehearsal had started late because Dr. Morland said the light wasn't right. He wasn't sure what that meant. I was. Time, for Morland, had become a matter of choreography. Charlotte Dean appeared at the chapel steps as we were leaving. She carried a folder of music, though her hands trembled just slightly, enough to make the papers flutter. She said she'd heard about our interest in the clock. I asked if she ever noticed it behaving strangely. She looked away, toward the bell tower, and said softly that at St. Simeon's nothing behaved strangely, not even sin. It was then I caught the scent, not perfume, not soap, but something faintly metallic, like old coins or candle smoke. I had smelled it before, in the vestry. She realized I'd noticed and changed the subject with graceful haste. That night I sat by the window of my flat with the choir's rehearsal tape playing through my old machine. Between two verses, there was a faint interval of silence, then a cough. A door creak, a whisper too low to distinguish. A man's voice, perhaps, though blurred by distance. I replayed it several times, each repetition eroding certainty rather than sharpening it. The bells of St. Simeon's began outside, marking the hour. I checked my watch. They were early. Not by much a minute, perhaps 2, but early all the same. I wondered who had taught them that habit. I poured a measure of whiskey and looked at the crossword from the day before. One clue lingered unfinished. Altered time. 6. I filled in Tampa, then stared at the word until it no longer meant anything at all. Just a faint sound, slightly off-key, echoing through a city that preferred its errors in tune. Evening returns differently to Oxford than to other cities. It doesn't fall, it seeps, insinuating itself into the folds of cloisters and the cracks of conscience. The light retreats reluctantly, leaving the scent of damp stone and a hush that feels rehearsed. That night, the hush seemed heavier, perhaps because we knew by then that the verger's death had been politely misfiled. Not an accident, not yet a murder, but something quietly deliberate. Lewis and I stood once again in the vestry, the air dense with polish and history. The whiskey tumbler had been washed and put away, though a faint trace of its ring still lingered on the wood. He asked why anyone would leave a drink beside the altar. I said that whiskey is a more faithful companion than most prayers. He didn't laugh, but he understood. We had found earlier that Kellen had been reviewing the chapel's repair accounts, an unremarkable duty, unless one noticed the discrepancy. A small fund marked lighting and acoustics was withdrawn twice over in consecutive months. The signatures of both Fortescue and Morland appeared beneath the transactions, one neat and deliberate, the other a nervous echo. It might have meant nothing. In Oxford, even dishonesty tends to wear the robes of tradition. Fortescue received us in his rooms, where the curtains were drawn, though daylight still pressed politely at the edges. He poured sherry, not whiskey, and spoke of college dignity as though it were a fragile relic in need of guarding. When I mentioned the altered accounts, he tightened his grip on the glass. I noticed the tremor in his hand, faint but persistent, like an unresolved chord. He muttered that Kellen misunderstood the ledger and that the college's financial matters were not for the uninitiated. Lewis shifted uneasily beside me. I preferred silence. People often fill it with their own guilt. That evening I returned alone. The chapel doors were unlocked, as they often are when faith expects few visitors. The air was cool, the candles extinguished. Only the faint smell of whiskey seemed to linger, that distinctive mix of peat and remorse. I sat in the last pew and listened to the clock mark the minutes. Each tick felt like a small judgment. I found myself remembering Kellen's hymnal, the verse marked with such quiet desperation, one step enough for me. I had dismissed it before as sentimental, but now it seemed almost prescient. A man takes one step too close to another's secret, and the rest is decided. Lewis had gone through Kellen's pockets earlier that day, nothing remarkable, save for a folded scrap of paper bearing a half-written note. Before the bell, I'll tell him the sentence ended there, as if interrupted mid-thought, perhaps by fear, perhaps by death. I thought again of the whiskey glass and the shared intimacy of it, a gesture between men who knew what silence could cost. As I sat there, I heard the faint echo of voices from the quadrangle. Morland's tone was unmistakably clipped, authoritative though the words were blurred by distance. A woman's reply followed, softer, uncertain. Charlotte Dean, perhaps. The conversation ended abruptly, the sound of retreating steps swallowed by the fog. When I rose to leave, I glanced once more at the altar. The silver chalice reflected the faint amber light from the sanctuary lamp. For an instant, I could almost imagine the reflection forming the shape of a glass of whiskey, not wine, and I wondered how easily one ritual became another. Back in my flat, I poured a measure and stared at the crossword folded beside my ashtray. The new clue read, "A false friend." 5, I wrote angel, then hesitated. An angel, after all, can be as much a messenger of deception as of truth. I thought of Kellen again, the quiet man who knew too much about other people's faith and too little about his own safety. He must have confronted someone that evening before Vespers. Perhaps he came with righteousness, perhaps he came simply with fear. Either way, someone had met him not with prayer, but with whiskey. Outside, the bells of St. Simeon's began their slow, sorrowful peal. I counted them 6, then a pause, then one uncertain echo. Time had been corrected, it seemed. The college would sleep soundly again. Only I sat awake, glass in hand, tasting both the comfort and the accusation of the hour. It was raining again, a fine, uncommitted drizzle that lent Oxford its usual air of exhausted dignity. The city was quieter than usual, though perhaps it was only my mind that had grown loud. I had returned to St. Simeon's that morning under the pretext of reviewing evidence, though what I was really seeking was atmosphere, the residue of something human left behind. The chapel smelled of candle wax, hymn books, and an older sorrow that no one had bothered to name. Kellen's things had been cleared away by then. Order restored, as if death were merely a brief administrative interruption. But order has its own kind of guilt. I walked behind the altar, more from instinct than logic, and there it was, a scrap of paper half tucked beneath a kneeler, curled from damp. It was a torn page from a psalter, old enough that the ink had begun to feather. Psalm 130, as it happened, "Out of the depths have I cried unto thee, O Lord." In the margin, written hastily, was a note for Charlotte, as promised. I placed it in my pocket before anyone saw. Lewis would have called it sentimental, and perhaps he would have been right. Still, the smallest handwriting can change the shape of a truth. Later that morning, I found Charlotte Dean in the music library. She looked up as if she had been expecting me, or now expecting something worse. The light through the tall windows fell in a pattern across her face that made her expression unreadable. I handed her the page without a word. She stared at it for a long while, and then said that Kellen had helped her with the transcription. An old motet by an obscure composer, she said, her voice flat, as if explaining a clerical error. The Psalter page, she claimed, had been used as scrap paper. I asked if she believed in coincidence. She smiled, not kindly. "In Oxford," she said, "everything is a coincidence until it isn't." Then she added, almost as an afterthought, that Kellen had been a good man. Too good, perhaps, for the place that employed him. When I left her, I walked through the cloisters and listened to the rain against the leaded glass. The sound had a rhythm of its own, like someone turning pages slowly, searching for the right verse. In the vestry, the air was cooler. A damp patch lingered on the flagstones where Kellen had fallen, though perhaps I imagined it. There is something indecent about the way stone remembers. I knelt beside the hymn board, running my fingers along the frame. A small brass key, almost invisible, lay lodged behind it, half swallowed by dust. It looked as if it had been there for years, though the faint trace of polish on its teeth told a different story. When I held it up to the light, I saw a small engraving TCH. The initials meant nothing then, but the key itself did. It matched the mechanism of the clock housing in the tower the one found tampered with. Someone, I realized, had made sure the time of death could be rewritten. Lewis joined me moments later, holding 2 cups of weak tea. He said the registrar had found something interesting. A second copy of the chapel accounts, unsigned with different figures entirely. I asked whose handwriting. He said Fortescue's, though the signature line was left blank. We stood there for a while, each drinking in silence. There are moments in investigation when certainty feels almost vulgar. I remember thinking that whatever had passed between those people, Fortescue, Morland, Charlotte, and Kellen, had less to do with greed than with something lonelier. Pride, perhaps, or devotion misplaced. That evening, I sat by the window of my flat and listened again to the recording of the choir rehearsal. The same hymn, the same breathless pause before the verse that should have followed. But this time I heard something faint buried beneath the music, the turning of a page, then a murmur. Not prayer, but apology. I poured myself a small whisky and unfolded the Psalter page on the table. The words blurred where the ink had run, but the line remained legible enough. "Let thine ears be attentive to the voice of my supplications." There was, I thought, a kind of bitter symmetry to it. Kellen had left behind his final confession not to the church, nor to justice, but to a woman who might never read it as such. The rain continued outside, soft as penitent breath. And somewhere beyond it, the bells of St. Simeon's began their evening practice imperfect, uncertain, as though the city itself were trying to tune its conscience. I have always thought there is something oddly deceitful about bells. They are instruments of faith, yet their purpose is to announce the time, and time, as I have learned, is seldom faithful to anyone. That evening, the bells of St. Simeon's rang out across the quadrangle with their usual melancholy precision. 6 o'clock. But I no longer trusted them. Lewis and I had spent the day comparing statements, and the contradictions were beginning to hum like a low chord beneath the surface of conversation. The choir boys swore they began rehearsal late. The porter's log insisted the bell rang early. The master believed both without believing either. And then there was Morland, too precise, too unbothered. I had seen his kind before, men for whom control was a sacrament. We returned to the tower together after dusk. The air smelled faintly of oil and old metal, and our torchlight trembled across the walls like an uncertain conscience. I examined the clock housing again. It had been adjusted. Yes, not broken, not even crudely altered, but set back deliberately by exactly 6 minutes. Lewis asked what that proved. I told him it proved that someone needed to create the illusion of punctuality. Death, after all, is rarely convenient. Below us, the chapel was lit for evensong. Through the grating we could hear the choir's voices, clean, bright, and slightly mournful. Lewis leaned on the railing, listening. He said it was beautiful. I said beauty is often just an arrangement of lies. He didn't argue. Later, in the master's lodge, we confronted Fortescue about the missing funds. He wilted almost instantly. He blamed Morland, saying he'd only signed and were told to sign, that he hadn't read the figures properly. His voice trembled like paper in a draft. When I asked if Kellen had confronted him, he looked genuinely surprised. He admitted that Kellen had raised questions, but claimed he thought nothing of it. He was a fussy man, Fortescue murmured, always punctual. The word lingered. Punctuality, a virtue, a curse, a clock wound too tightly. Outside, Lewis said he pitied Fortescue. I said pity was a form of laziness. He thought about that longer than usual. Back in my flat that night, I went through the evidence again. The Psalter page, the altered ledger, the misplaced whiskey glass. I kept returning to the sound of the bell as everyone remembered it differently. A chime heard or unheard, early or late, just before Vespers or just after. Time, it seemed, was elastic at St. Simeon's, stretched to fit the conscience of whoever recalled it. I poured a measure and turned on the tape of the choir rehearsal once more. Between the verses of lead, kindly light, there it was again, a faint noise, metallic and precise, the winding of a clock key. I had heard it before, but mistaken it for background. Now it was clear. Someone had been in the tower during the rehearsal. Someone who wanted the bells to lie. Lewis arrived uninvited, carrying a newspaper folded neatly under his arm. He said the pathologist had confirmed heart failure, but added that bruising on the back of Kellen's head suggested a fall or something more persuasive. He asked whether I still thought it was murder. I told him I thought it was worse than murder, it was choreography. A death staged to the rhythm of the liturgy, each movement planned to look accidental. He frowned, said he didn't follow. I said that most crimes in Oxford were about reputation, not rage. After he left, I sat alone for a long while. Through the open window came the sound of the bells again, measured, immaculate, deceitful. I thought of Morland's metronome, ticking without need of touch, and of Fortescue's shaking hand. I thought of Charlotte Dean's silence, which had begun to seem rehearsed. I picked up the crossword. The next clue read, Truth Distorted 5. I filled in lie, then paused and wrote it again in the next box, side by side. 2 lies, perfectly symmetrical, ringing in harmony like the bells of St. Simeon's. False bells, true alibis. And in that symmetry, I felt the first faint toll of understanding. There are sounds in Oxford that do not quite belong to the living. The faint creak of a choir stall, the flutter of a page turned by memory rather than hand, the echo of a hymn left unfinished. That night, listening to the recording again in my flat, I thought I heard all of them. Between the verses of Lead, kindly light came a space too deliberate to be an accident, a pause filled not with silence but intention, then a soft click, the winding of a mechanism, a clock key perhaps, or something wound tighter still, the conscience of a man. The rain had begun again. It streaked the window like notation, irregular and resigned. I poured a measure of whiskey, the sort that makes one feel thoughtful rather than warm, and let the recording play again. The same cough, the same faint door creak, and then a murmur. I could not make out words, only the cadence of secrecy. The next morning, Lewis and I visited Charlotte Dean in her rooms overlooking the back garden. She was pale, though not the sort of pale that comes from guilt, rather from long rehearsals of composure. She told us she had nothing to add, that her relationship with Morland was purely academic. The phrase made her wince as she said it. I asked if she was certain. She replied that certainty was a privilege of the dead. There was a letter open on her desk, the ink still wet in one corner. I noticed the indentation of the paper beneath faint words transferred from the pressure of her pen. You cannot undo what was done before the bells. I didn't mention it then. Some truths have to be left alone long enough to ripen. Morland's rooms were darker than before, as though he'd begun to close the curtains earlier each day. He greeted us with a politeness that felt like dust old, unavoidable, and without purpose. He claimed to have been in his study the evening of the death, grading essays. I asked if anyone could confirm that. He said no, though he reminded me that solitude was an occupational hazard of intellect. The remark was meant to sound sardonic, but something trembled underneath. As we left, I paused at his piano. A single sheet of music lay there, not a hymn, but a transcription of the motet Charlotte had mentioned. One line had been altered. The notation now contained a pause where there had been none, a rest between 2 notes. I asked who had changed it. He said Kellen must have done so while helping with the copying. The lie was elegant, but too symmetrical to be true. That afternoon, Lewis returned from the college archives. He had found an older photograph of the chapel staff, the verger, the master, Morland, and a younger Charlotte seated at the organ. Between them, just visible, a clock key hanging on a ribbon near the altar, the same one I'd found behind the hymn board. It seemed almost ornamental, a token of trust. In the evening, I walked the college grounds alone. The fog moved low, curling around the paving stones like smoke from an extinguished thought. I could hear faint music drifting from the practice room, a hymn played too slowly, or perhaps too beautifully, for comfort. I paused by the tower door. The mechanism inside the clock ticked steadily, innocent of its own manipulation. Sometimes, I think, deceit is not spoken at all, but rests quietly between the notes in what is withheld rather than said. The falsified alibis, the adjusted times, the pages torn and rewritten, all of them small silences pretending to be ordered. Back in my flat, I wrote a single word in my notebook. It seemed the only fitting clue. Not a break in music, but in truth. I replayed the recording one last time. The same hymn, the same faint breath before the final line. But this time, I heard a whisper at the edge of audibility, Morland's voice perhaps, or conscience itself, saying something that could have been prayer, or confession, or simply the soft acknowledgement of defeat. When it ended, I didn't stop the tape. I let the reel spin in the empty silence, listening to the gentle hiss that followed. It reminded me that absence has its own kind of sound, one that lingers long after the last note fades. There comes a point in every investigation when the noise subsides and what remains is silence, not peace, but a kind of clarity that feels like punishment. That morning, Oxford lay under a pale sky washed clean by rain. The spires gleamed faintly as though newly forgiven. I had slept little. The tape still played somewhere in my thoughts, that fragment of breath between verses that wound in the music where truth had been hiding. Lewis met me at the college gate. He looked tired, though he's not the sort who admits to weariness. He said Morland had asked to see us. His voice was steady, but I caught the faint undercurrent of pity. We walked the length of the cloister in silence, our footsteps echoing in measured rhythm, like the ticking of a repaired clock. Morland was waiting in his rooms, the curtains drawn against the watery light. The piano stood open, a single sheet of music upon it. He was impeccably dressed, though his tie sat slightly askew, an imperfection that troubled him, I could tell. He gestured toward the decanter, but neither of us accepted. He began speaking almost at once. He said he'd had time to reflect. He spoke not of guilt nor innocence, but of fatigue, of what it costs a man to live in a world where error and sin are merely variations in tone. He described Kellen's final visit when the verger had come to confront him about the false accounts, not for money, but for conscience. He said Kellen had threatened to tell the master before Vespers. There had been whiskey, there had been anger, and then a fall. Nothing theatrical, he said. Merely a fall. I asked if he adjusted the clock before or after. His eyes flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw the ghost of relief, as though confession were less a burden than the uncertainty of silence. He said he hadn't meant to deceive, only to preserve order. The words struck me as both pathetic and profound. Oxford has always valued order above truth. Lewis stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back. He asked quietly why Morland hadn't told us sooner. Morland smiled faintly, the kind of smile men wear when they've lost the argument with their own souls. Because, he said, even the truth must be in tune. On his desk lay the Psalter page I'd once given to Charlotte. Its edges were pressed flat, as though someone had been smoothing out the past. He saw me glance at it and said Kellen had left it behind that evening, a token of reconciliation. I believed him, though not entirely. There are truths that fit too neatly to be trusted. When he finished, there was nothing more to say. The air in that room seemed fragile, as though one word might cause it to shatter. Lewis made the formalities of procedure sound almost merciful. Morland listened, nodded, then turned toward the piano. He placed his hands gently on the keys, not to play, but to rest there. I remember the stillness of it, a man holding on to the last physical object that had ever obeyed him. We left him there. By the time we reached the quadrangle, the bells began to ring. This time, they were perfectly on time, not early, not late. Lewis remarked that at least the mechanism had been corrected. I said nothing. There is something obscene about repair when the music has already ended. That evening I walked along the river. The water carried the reflection of the college lights, soft and uneven. I thought about Kellen, about Charlotte, about all the people who move quietly through life, doing what they think is right, and finding that virtue has no vocabulary for consequence. At home, I opened the last crossword Kellen had begun. One clue remained unanswered. Sound of Repentance, 7. I wrote Vesper, then hesitated and added an S. The plural felt truer. There is never just one. The bells of St. Simeon's began again outside my window, their tones now whole, harmonious, complete. I listened until the sound dissolved into the distance. Somewhere between the final chime and the silence that followed, I thought I heard another softer, more human note than the last verse that never made it to paper. The evening light had that peculiar pallor Oxford saves for its endings, not golden, not grey, but something indecisive, like a thought refusing to conclude. I remember standing outside St. Simeon's and listening to the choir gather. The air carried the faint scent of rain-soaked ivy and candle wax. The bells, punctual now, sounded the hour with a kind of weary dignity. 6 strokes, evenly spaced, as though the city were reminding itself that order could still exist. Morland had been taken away quietly that afternoon. No protest, no spectacle. He had thanked Lewis for his courtesy, a gesture so measured it might have been rehearsed. Watching him leave, I had felt no triumph, only the dull echo of inevitability. The pattern had been too symmetrical to end any other way. A man obsessed with time, undone by his attempt to control it. The choir began their Vespers. I lingered near the back, unseen. The first notes rose like breath in winter air, fragile but insistent. The hymn was familiar, lead, kindly light, the same one marked in Kellen's hymnal, the one whose final verse had been left unsung. I closed my eyes. The voices blurred into something less musical, more human, the sound of forgiveness rehearsed, but never quite believed. Lewis arrived halfway through the service, his coat damp from the mist. He stood beside me without speaking. When the choir paused between verses, he whispered that Morland had given a full statement. I nodded. There was no satisfaction in it, only the faint ache of confirmation. He asked if I believed the story, the confrontation, the fall, the adjusted clock. I said I believed the music of it, if not the words. He frowned, not unkindly. He has never understood that truth often arrives out of tune. Afterwards, we walked through the quadrangle. The cobblestones glistened under the lamps, and the rain began again, the light, persistent drizzle that seems to bless and accuse in equal measure. I told him about the crossword, the last clue. Sound of repentance. 7. He waited for the answer. I said there wasn't one I liked. He smiled. Said perhaps that was the point. When he left, I remained a while longer. The chapel door was still open, and from within came the faint hum of the organ. A single chord held too long, uncertain whether to resolve or fade. I stepped inside. The candles near the altar burned low, their flames steady but small. On the lectern lay the psalter I had returned to the college. Someone had turned it back to Psalm 130. Out of the depths have I cried unto thee. The words looked different now, less plea, more remembrance. I thought of Kellen then, the quiet man who had died for punctuality, for conscience, for the illusion that truth must always be timely. And of Charlotte, who would remain her fellowship assured, her silence intact. Oxford protects its survivors. It always has. As I turned to leave, I noticed the bell rope swaying gently, though no wind stirred. It might have been the draught from the open door, something less explainable, the inertia of ritual, perhaps. I reached out and steadied it. The rope was coarse, rough against the skin, yet faintly warm, as though it still remembered the hands that last touched it. Outside, the city had settled into its familiar hush. The sound of footsteps carried across the courtyard, and then the faint, closing click of a distant gate. I walked slowly back toward Jericho, the pavement slick beneath the lamplight. At home, I poured a small whiskey, not for comfort, but for punctuation. The liquid caught the lamplight and flickered like memory itself. I sat by the window, listening to the last bells drift through the mist. Their tone was pure, unwavering, and yet something within me resisted their finality. When the echo faded, I realized it had not been the bells I was listening for, but the silence that followed that fragile space between sound and absence where all meaning resides. It is there, I think, that Oxford keeps its truth not in confession nor punishment, but in the pause that follows. The moment before the last note disappears. The moment before Vespers ends.